people like me. You need people like me so you can point your f***ing fingers and say, that's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy. That's the bad guy.
To the mother relay, we're covering today's top boxing news.
Okay, we'll start with this. I'm sure most of you have heard by now. News broke yesterday that amicable terms have been reached by both Ryan Garcia's team and Gervonta Davis's. And to that, Ryan Garcia reacted to the news by way of his social media saying, "I'm so pumped. This fight is finally in place. I want it more than anything right now. I've put in the work. I'm at the prime of my career, and I know I'm going to be the biggest boxer in the world. The legacy starts today." You know, Ryan Garcia for a long time has been saying that he really wants this fight, that this is the fight for him. You never saw Ryan this enthusiastic about a Lomachenko fight, and certainly not a Devin Haney fight. He actually walked away from that fight when he became Devin's mandatory challenger. But when it comes to Gervonta, he's been adamant throughout. He wants to get him in the ring, and now he might be able to. Ryan added, "Boxing needs this fight right now. It's time for us to get back to what made this sport so great for the fans. Glamorous fights in places like Las Vegas, grudge match storylines, and most importantly, the best fighting the best." Is that really what this is, though? Listen, I don't want to sound like I'm poo-pooing all over the fight, poo-pooing all over this thing, but neither Ryan Garcia or Gervonta Davis have established themselves as the best in show at lightweight or super lightweight. So while it's a very popular fight and a commercially viable fight, is it really the best versus the best? Bit hard to say. Oscar De La Hoya, by way of Golden Boy Promotions' social media account, stated, "The fans have been crystal clear that the fight they want is Ryan versus Tank. Golden Boy Promotions and I are proud to be leading the drive to get this fight signed and are excited to get a deal finalized as soon as possible." Is this really the best versus the best, though? What I see are two very popular young fighters that have cult followings of their own, both Ryan and Gervonta, coming together to make a bigger fight than any fight they can have individually. But this fight doesn't establish who the best lightweight is or who the best super lightweight is. It's a big fight. Everybody involved can make a lot of money from it, but it doesn't actually establish who the best lightweight or super lightweight is. It doesn't. Oscar De La Hoya continued, "It's high time that those outside of the ring stop getting in the way of those who want nothing more than to get into the ring and fight. Our motto has always been that the fans come first, and this is just another example of how we're leading by example." And I've always approached this fight with some skepticism based on how many fingers are in this pie. Two separate fighters with their two separate competing promotional outfits and those two platforms, separate platforms. I'm still skeptical. DAZN's Joe Markowski took to social media saying, "As we've always said, DAZN will look to broadcast the biggest fights in boxing. We've worked tirelessly with our friends at Golden Boy, Showtime, and Team Davis on a deal structure that suits all parties for Gervonta Davis versus Ryan Garcia. Everyone at DAZN Boxing is thrilled that an agreement in principle has been reached between the parties. That agreement is subject to contract, which are yet to be exchanged." As you sift through the confetti and the preliminary celebrations, you realize that the ink hasn't hit the paper yet. The fight isn't actually signed, sealed, and delivered yet. The fight isn't actually done because the ink hasn't hit the paper. And as of yesterday, they hadn't even exchanged contracts yet. I will say that it's encouraging that we're receiving this news from Joe Markowski, from Oscar De La Hoya, from Ryan, and Gervonta, and even longtime Showtime executive Stefan Espinoza. That we're hearing this news from all sides is encouraging, but make no mistake, the fight's not done yet. It's not even going to be Gervonta Davis's next fight. Preliminary reports indicate he's going to be coming back in January. For those of you that might have forgot, Gervonta Davis himself, by way of his own social media, has been hinting at a January return set to take place in Washington, D.C., his neck of the woods. We talked about that in my previous video. But if Gervonta's next fight is going to take place in Washington, D.C., well, he can't be fighting Ryan Garcia next. And he's not. The rumor is he's fighting Hector
Garcia.
Per a tweet from Mike Coppinger via his sources, the date for Gervonta Davis versus Ryan Garcia is April 15th. Sources tell ESPN. Of course, Gervonta must first emerge victorious and uninjured from a January 7th tune-up. Garcia might take a tune-up in January, too. The fighters both said both Ryan and Gervonta have stated that their fight will take place in Las Vegas at a contracted weight of 136 pounds. Wait a minute. Why 136 pounds? Why the catch weight? Gervonta Davis was perfectly fine fighting at 140 when it was Mario Barrios. It's kind of obvious. Mario Barrios, the very unheralded Mario Barrios, isn't very good. Didn't prove anything at 140.
While Ryan Garcia hasn't proven all that much either at either 135 or 140, he does exhibit a higher ceiling than a Mario Barrios.
Ryan Garcia is already a taller fighter than Gervonta Davis, a longer fighter, perhaps even a faster fighter, or at minimum, Ryan's speed may rival Gervonta's speed. Thus, Gervonta wants every conceivable advantage. He wants to bring him down a few pounds.
That's what that is.
So here's how it breaks down. Gervonta Davis's next fight isn't Ryan Garcia.
It's rumored to be Hector Garcia. He won't be fighting Ryan until April, and he's got to beat Hector first.
And in between January and April, Gervonta's got two court dates. One on the 11th of January and another in February.
So don't dish out the cake and confetti just yet.
As stated, it's encouraging that Ryan Garcia and Gervonta Davis and Joe Markowski and Oscar De La Hoya and even Stefan Espinoza, it's encouraging that everybody's saying the same thing.
It's encouraging, it is. It's a good sign, but the fight's not done, and the fight's not next.
That's what you need to know. The ink hasn't hit the paper, and the fight's not next. And in between Gervonta Davis's next fight and the proposed Ryan Garcia fight in April, he's got two separate court dates, two separate court appearances he must make.
Between now and April, something could go wrong. There's a lot of time there.
The moral of this story is, we're not out of the woods. We're not across the finish line. Not yet. In men's middleweight news, ahead of his fight this weekend, Jaime Munguia hopes to land a fight with Gennady Golovkin in 2023 next year.
I've actually broached that subject once or twice here on the channel before, that it's a distinct possibility.
The last we heard in reference to Gennady Golovkin is that he's set to return to action in the first quarter of next year towards the tail end of it against Esquiva Falcao, Brazilian Olympian, unbeaten up-and-comer, and southpaw Esquiva Falcao in defense of his two alphabet titles.
And if Gennady Golovkin wins that fight and he's all right, he can fight Jaime later on next year.
As far as Jaime, now Munguia faces an opponent who was knocked out in 2 rounds by current WBO champion Yanni Bekalim Kanulai. Corea is a lot of risk and little to gain. Obviously, I'm not belittling this fighter, and I'm never going to belittle anyone. I always prepare in the best way. The truth is that this second fight in Mexico was not foreseen. We planned to fight John Ryder, who had just beaten Daniel Jacobs in what I think was a great fight, but for one reason or another, it didn't happen. We're going to try to make the best of this fight. Keep learning, keep working for when the expected fight comes, said Munguia to Erica Montoya of DAZN.
I will admit, I would have liked to see Jaime Munguia opposite the ring, John Ryder, but John Ryder's got his own fight coming up, an equally exciting fight with unbeaten Zach Parker for WBO interim status.
Now, what exactly went wrong between the Ryder people and the Munguia people? Your guess is as good as mine, but what I do know is that there's actually more in it for John in a Zach Parker fight than there would have been in a Munguia fight. If he can beat Zach Parker, he would then become the WBO's interim champion and mandatory challenger to Canelo Alvarez.
That's what he stands to gain, WBO interim status, whereas in a fight with Jaime Munguia, he wouldn't stand to gain anything. Jaime's not a champion or an interim champion. I mean,
stylistically, both fights would have been equally exciting, either a Parker fight or a Munguia fight, but the difference, what separates them is he actually stands to gain something if he can beat Zach Parker.
It's likely what influenced his decision.
Must have had some role to play. Jaime Munguia, he now aspires to get Gennady Golovkin in the ring at some point next year, and he might. He was quoted as saying, without a doubt, the last fight that he had with Canelo, Triple G made it clear that he still is a great fighter, that he still is strong, that he still is valid. He gave a great fight with Canelo, and I think he and I could have a great fight. Besides, he is the champion, one of the champions at 160 pounds, and if it's with him, I would like to fight for the world championship, Munguia said.
Gennady Golovkin and Jaime Munguia. Those two names have been attached in some way, shape, or form, or another, for the last 4 years.
It was in 2018 that proposition was first brought up, and the Nevada State Athletic Commission, at least at that time, they didn't feel that Jaime had enough experience to box with someone the caliber of a Gennady Golovkin, so they rejected the fight.
But in the subsequent years that followed, Gennady Golovkin versus Jaime Munguia, at least as a conversation, it survived.
Not dissimilar from what we saw with the Murata fight, the Murata situation. For some years prior to their actual meeting, their actual fight, the name of Ryota Murata was thrown around as a potential opponent option for Gennady. In subsequent years that followed, the fight materialized. The same may happen when it comes to Jaime.
It might.
Gennady Golovkin still reigns as a unified middleweight champion here today. He's supposed to be taking on unbeaten Brazilian up-and-comer, southpaw, Esquiva Falcao. And if he makes it through that guy...
Well, don't forget, Erislandy Lara's in the queue also. Erislandy Lara, former junior middleweight champion Erislandy Lara, who's currently campaigning at middleweight. He's Gennady's mandatory challenger by way of the WBA.
I believe if push comes to shove, and Gennady has to choose between hanging on to the WBA title or going his own way and fighting Jaime Munguia, I believe that he would choose Jaime in that situation because there's more in it for him.
I believe that if push comes to shove and he has to drop the WBA title and surrender it to Lara, that's what he would do so he could proceed with a Munguia fight.
Let me tell you something. Lara in his prime wasn't worth no money. He ain't worth no money now here today when he's past his prime, I'm sorry to say. He's a very skilled boxer, very accomplished, but he don't bring money to the table.
Jaime might, in the form of those die-hard Mexican boxing fans, those Chicano fans here stateside.
It's a no-brainer. Golovkin versus Munguia is a bigger fight than Golovkin versus Lara. And for an aging fighter, an aging champion, who's still hanging on,
who hasn't decided to retire yet, hasn't called it a career.
He wants one more big payday. I'm of the opinion, based on Gennady's performance in his last outing against Canelo Alvarez, the third installment of their saga, I'm of the opinion that based on how Gennady fought, he made a decision that he's not going to gamble in that fight. He's going to survive. He's going to make his money.
He's going to go a few rounds, but he's going to preserve himself and live to fight another day.
A lot of people focused on Canelo, who suffered an injury in that fight, injury to his wrist, and they focused on Canelo not realizing it takes two to tango.
Canelo didn't ragdoll Gennady Golovkin. He didn't. He didn't open him up, and he didn't finish him.
He didn't. But what stood out to me was that Gennady Golovkin was a lot less ambitious in the third fight than he was in the first two. Seemed like he really wasn't trying.
The offensive effort that we saw in the third fight was not akin to what we saw in the first two. In the first two, he wanted to go to war with Canelo, but in the third installment...
In the third fight, I'm of the opinion that he made a decision within himself that he's going to go the rounds with Canelo and he's probably going to lose, so he's going to try his best to minimize the damage, preserve himself, and live to fight another day, because he still is a reigning champion in the middleweight division.
And I'm 100% sure the people over there at the Zone would love to bankroll a fight like Golovkin versus Munguia, a young unbeaten up-and-comer that needs a signature fight, a big fight.
Guy who's been waiting in the kiddie pool all these years with lackluster opponents.
A Golovkin fight could be the proverbial launch pad for Jaime Munguia.
All Munguia's got to do is beat this Corea guy this weekend. Guy who was knocked out in 2 rounds by Yanibek Alimkhanulai, who was in action last week.
All he's got to do is beat Corea, and all Golovkin's got to do is beat Falcao.
If the both of those guys can get through their next fights, they can do a fight with each other. They box on the same platform.
I think both Gennady Golovkin and Jaime Munguia jointly are looking for safe options, safe choices.
For an aging fighter, an aging champion like a Gennady Golovkin, a guy like Jaime Munguia, a limited guy with a bit of a cult following, but still a limited guy, a limited fighter, for him, this is a safe choice.
Gennady can't compete at the level that he used to. He's not the same fighter that he used to be.
Not the same wrecking machine. But opposite the ring, a limited fighter like a Jaime Munguia, he might like his chances. And the same may be true, to some extent, in reverse. Jaime Munguia Munguia didn't want to know.
He didn't want to fight a Demetrius Andrade. They pulled him out of those Charlo negotiations.
And I believe that currently he's got a top spot by way of the WBO that lines him up for a Janibek Alimkanulai fight.
But I don't think Jaime's after that fight.
No more than he was after the Demetrius Andrade fight when Demetrius was the reigning WBO champion. No. In spite of Janibek Alimkanulai's lackluster showing against Denzel Bentley, I'm of the opinion that if Jaime has to choose, he'll choose a Golovkin fight over an Alimkanulai fight because Gennady Golovkin has more name value than Janibek Alimkanulai, and he's an aging fighter, an aging champion.
Pretty sure Golden Boy would be receptive to such a fight because they need to get some more champions in their stable.
It's about time that Jaime Munguia fought for a full-fledged middleweight title.
I've been seeing him pounce on these guys, these ham and egg guys, long enough. It's time for him to step it up. And Gennady Golovkin, even an aging Gennady Golovkin, would be better than the guys he's been fighting.
The fight has box office appeal, serious box office potential. If they do this right, and Jaime stays in character this weekend, and he knocks this Correa guy's block off, if Gennady
can get back to his winning ways and successfully defend his alphabet titles.
If he beats Esquiva Falcao, more so if he knocks him out, because I think this guy might have been playing possum in that Canelo Alvarez trilogy.
If he can get back to his winning ways, if he can knock out a young, unbeaten up-and-comer, a southpaw in Esquiva Falcao.
You know, Gennady Golovkin can't compete with the Canelo Alvarez's of the world. Not anymore. The saving grace for Gennady is that, well, there ain't a whole lot of fighters like that at middleweight. You know, Esquiva Falcao, he's no Canelo Alvarez, and neither is Jaime Munguia. He likely likes his chances against these fighters more so than opposite the ring somebody like Canelo, which is why he didn't take any chances, which is why I think he was playing possum in that fight. He knew he couldn't win it.
But he also knew what he stood to make. He also knew what it was worth.
Fiscally, it was the biggest fight out there for him, so it's worth the risks. It
was worth doing.
Even if he knew he couldn't win, it was worth it. But opposite the ring of Falcao and opposite the ring of Munguia, well, that's a different ballgame.
To Gennady Golovkin, Jaime Munguia may seem limited enough and beatable enough that he goes through with it. And there's actually a financial incentive because Golovkin versus Munguia is a bigger fight than any fight they can have separately.
Yeah, you could do Golovkin versus Andrade. It's a great fight. Golovkin versus Charlo, unification match. Also a great fight, but it don't get the same reception that Golovkin versus Munguia would get at the box office and at the gate.
And that's what I think he's thinking.
Or he will be when the time comes. When it comes to Jaime Munguia, well, this would be a passing of the torch fight for him, an aging fighter, an aging champion, who's only ever lost to Canelo Alvarez, of all people. There's no shame in that.
And he still has more name value than anybody else at 160 pounds.
More titles, too. From where I'm sitting, Golovkin versus Munguia next year is a distinct possibility.
It can happen.